Hey, what's up? It's Takomi. In today's video, I'm going to give you one of the deepest, most complete breakdowns you'll find of the true nature of the law of attraction through the lens of cutting-edge quantum mechanics. In my model, the law of attraction is a physical phenomenon caused by an information gravity well that your consciousness creates in information space. Once you understand this, you'll find that opportunities, luck, connections, and money naturally flow into your life, even without trying that hard. On the other hand, if you don't understand this mechanism, you'll stay trapped in a loop where no matter how hard you work, reality keeps pulling you back to a state of lack. I originally conducted research in quantum physics and related fields at a major electronics manufacturer's research lab. Everything I'm sharing today is based on that first-hand experience as a former researcher. Make sure you stick around until the end. Have you ever tried reading books on the law of attraction? Or practicing daily affirmations and journaling? Sure. Maybe it made you feel a little more positive. But when it comes to your actual physical reality and relationships, your income hasn't changed and the same relationship drama keeps repeating itself. I think a lot of people can relate to that. For people in that situation, there's a fundamental reason why the dynamics of attraction aren't working for them. And that answer is today's theme, the energy gradient. Just as Einstein explained that gravity is really the curvature of space, our consciousness also creates a kind of distortion in the world of information. Successful people have an overwhelmingly heavy core of consciousness, and it creates a massive well in the surrounding information space. That's why without desperately wishing for anything, the opportunities, money, and connections they need naturally roll toward them, like a ball rolling down a slope. On the flip side, people who are working hard but keep getting tossed around by reality, they're trying to use techniques alone, while their weight of consciousness is still too light. In this state, no matter how many wishes you write in your journal, your core of consciousness is hollow, so reality won't budge even a millimeter. That's exactly why you first need to rewrite the core of consciousness itself to make it heavier and denser. In fact, my students have been reporting one incredible transformation after another from the moment they understood this algorithm. A freelancer who attracted 15 million yen in revenue in just 2 weeks, someone who received tens of millions in unexpected income, and even people who repaired relationships that seemed beyond saving and found their ideal partnership. The list of examples is endless. These aren't miracles, they're the natural result of changing the gravity of consciousness. Now, what I'm going to share today will fundamentally change the way you see your life. However, there's some deeper material that's difficult to fully unpack in a single YouTube video, including the specific information gravity manipulation techniques, and I'm turning all of it into a free, in-depth resource for you right now. It's coming soon, exclusively for subscribers. So subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss it, and leave a comment with your experience of the law of attraction or any question you want answered. I read every single one. Now, from here, I'm going to go deep into the double-slit experiment, the key to understanding why observation sits at the very heart of physical reality. First, I want you to picture this. Imagine there's a board in front of you with two thin vertical openings, two slits. Behind it, you place a screen that records whatever hits it. Now, what happens if you start throwing visible, macroscopic particles like baseballs through these slits, one after another? The answer is simple, right? Most balls bounce off the board, and only the ones that happen to pass through the slits pile up as two distinct lines on the screen behind it. That's the common sense of the macroscopic world we all know. So, what happens when you send waves through instead? Think of waves spreading across the surface of water, or sound waves. When waves hit the two slits, they split into two separate waves on the other side and spread out in a fan-like pattern. And then those split waves overlap with each other again. This is where a fascinating phenomenon called interference occurs. Waves have peaks and troughs. When peak meets peak, or trough meets trough, the waves combine and become stronger and taller. This is what we call being in phase. Conversely, when a peak meets a trough, they cancel each other out and the wave disappears. As a result, the screen displays an alternating pattern of bright bands where waves reinforced each other and dark bands where they canceled out. This is called an interference pattern. In other words, the appearance of these stripes is the telltale signature that waves passed through. So far, this is basic high school physics. But when you run the same experiment in the quantum world, the microscopic realm, this common sense completely falls apart. Scientists decided to try the experiment using subatomic particles, electrons that make up our bodies, and photons, the smallest units of light. And astonishingly, the screen showed the exact same interference pattern as waves. In other words, light and electrons, which should be collections of particles, actually turned out to have the properties of waves. But here's the thing, light and electrons also have a minimum indivisible particle unit. When you reduce the intensity of light to the absolute minimum, at some point the amount of light drops to zero all at once. This is how physicists confirm that light has the smallest possible unit, a single grain, meaning it has particle properties. And when you actually check the moment they hit the photographic plate on the other side, they're always detected as a single dot. They never arrive as some thinly spread out wave. So scientists came up with an even stranger experiment. They decided to fire photons, one at a time, very slowly, so that only a single photon exists in the apparatus at any given moment. There's nothing to interfere with, so naturally, the screen should show just two lines like when you throw balls, right? But the result was different. When they accumulated the dots one by one on the screen, the interference pattern emerged once again. Only one particle passed through at a time, so what did it interfere with? The most widely accepted explanation is mind-bending. That single particle passed through both slits simultaneously as a wave and interfered with itself. In other words, a particle that should exist in one place was drifting in a ghost-like state, passing through both the right slit and the left slit at the same time, until the moment it was observed. That's ridiculous. Let's just check which slit it actually went through. That's what scientists thought. And they used every high-tech device available to observe which slit right or left the particle passed through. And then something happened that was shocking enough to change the course of history. The moment a detector was switched on to check which slit it went through, the interference pattern that had been visible until then suddenly vanished, and the screen showed nothing but two plane, the quantum that had just been passing through both slits. Simultaneously, as a wave instantly reverted to just a particle going through only one slit the moment it was being measured. Doesn't that freak you out a little? It's as if the quantum realized, oh, I'm being watched, and changed its behavior. In the standard interpretation, the rule of this world is, until observed, everything exists in a wave state where all possibilities are superposed. But the moment it's observed, a single reality is determined. This is the measurement problem, considered one of the greatest mysteries in modern physics. And this strange property doesn't just apply to which slit a particle went through. It leads to an even more astonishing phenomenon, rewriting history by reaching back into the past. Even more remarkably, this kind of quantum behavior might actually alter past events as well. In fact, there are many cases in quantum experiments that look exactly like this kind of retroactive rewriting of the past. For example, a few years ago, a team from RIKEN and Hitachi published what's known as the V-shaped double-slit experiment. The results of this experiment are truly mind-blowing. They shake the very foundations of everything we thought we knew about physics. So what makes this experiment so extraordinary? Normally, you'd think that the moment an electron passes through a slit, its nature, whether it's a wave or a particle, should already be determined, right? But the RIKEN team thoroughly investigated how that nature is determined after the electron has already passed through the slit. They placed a special V-shaped slit inside the experimental apparatus and deliberately applied a special operation to reveal the electron's path after it had already passed through. The first thing they tested was what's called a pre-interference condition and post-interference condition. These are settings where the electron's path, whether it went through the right or left slit, can be identified from the results afterward. When they set up conditions where the path could be determined after the fact, something astonishing happened. The electron behaved as if it had traveled back in time and said, I was a single particle from the very beginning. An electron that may have had wave-like properties just moments before the instant the observation conditions were set landed as a single dot on the particle screen, and the interference pattern completely vanished. In other words, it's as if the future observation reached back and settled the past nature as a particle. But this is where it gets even more interesting. Using the exact same apparatus, they ran the experiment under the interference condition, a setting where it's absolutely impossible to determine which slit the electron went through. And guess what happened? The electron did a complete 180 and drew a beautiful interference pattern on the screen, as if to say, I was away from the very start, passing through both slits at once. The crucial point is that all of these condition changes were made after the electron had already passed through the slits. An event that should have been finished the moment the particle passed through the slit behaved as if it had been rewritten into a different past history, depending on how it was observed in the future. I think this is an experimental result that fundamentally challenges our understanding of causality. From here, we're going to dive even deeper into territory that destroys the very concept of time itself. Don't you assume that time flows in only one direction from the past to the future? But in the world of quantum mechanics, even this common sense about time doesn't hold up. The key here is a pair of phenomena: quantum entanglement and retrocausality. Quantum entanglement is a phenomenon where paired particles remain linked as a single system no matter how far apart they are. And some of the latest research suggests that this connection transcends not only space, but time as well. A few years ago, a research team from the University of Cambridge published a simulation experiment that sent shockwaves through the scientific world. In simple terms, their simulation suggested that specific observations or operations performed in the future can intentionally correct measurement results from the past. In the world of physics, this is called retrocausality, and it strongly suggests the possibility that the future can act as a cause, creating the past as its effect. You might be thinking, that's insane. There's no way you can change the past once it's already happened. And sure, a past that has already been firmly determined and manifested into visible form, a particle-like past probably can't be changed. But if the past has not yet been observed by anyone and still exists as an undetermined wave of possibilities, that's a completely different story. In my actual coaching work, these kinds of inexplicable things that look exactly like this physical phenomenon happen all the time. For example, when someone sets a powerful future goal and begins intensely observing the reality of this is who I want to become from this very moment, suddenly they discover a brand new fact reaching back into the past. Actually, that event from back then was what led to my success today, something they never noticed before. It's not just a change in interpretation. It feels as though that past was physically selected after the fact as the cause of the present. Some of my students have even more interesting experiences. A bank account they have no memory of creating suddenly turns up, and when they investigate, it turns out their past self had deposited money there years ago. The person vaguely recalls, "Oh yeah, I guess I did do that, but it looks like the brain is retroactively rewriting memories to maintain causal consistency." In this way, causality is far more ambiguous and fluid than we think. In physics, there's a concept called block universe theory. It's a theory that says every moment of the past, present, and future already exists simultaneously, like individual frames in a flipbook. We might simply be shining the spotlight of our consciousness onto one frame at a time, from that infinite collection of scenes, experiencing it as our now. We don't yet have a definitive conclusion on how far quantum mechanical effects influence our everyday macroscopic world. But this pattern where intentional observation from the future side seems to rewrite the connections between present and past data and accelerate. Attraction is something I've watched play out in case after case with my students. In other words, if you seriously begin observing your ideal future, even your past history can be rewritten to support that future. Now, how does this physical mechanism where the future determines the past play out in us as macroscopic human beings? Next, let's unravel this mystery by examining famous thought experiments through the lens of cutting-edge science. Having heard all of this, some of you might be thinking, but isn't that just about tiny particles we can't even see? Or it doesn't have anything to do with our actual lives, does it? But cutting-edge science is beginning to reveal that these strange quantum behaviors show up at far larger scales than anyone expected. The first thing we need to address is the famous thought experiment known as Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger, one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, came up with this thought experiment as a way to ridicule the strangeness of quantum theory. If you apply the rules of quantum mechanics directly to a cat, then until you open the box, a living cat and a dead cat would exist at the same time. That's absurd, but modern science has actually succeeded in creating this supposedly impossible state. Recently, a research team at ETH Zurich published an experiment that stunned the world. They used a sapphire crystal large enough to be seen with the naked eye and maintained it in two different states simultaneously, vibrating and still, essentially recreating Schrodinger's cat at a macroscopic scale. In other words, they demonstrated that even surprisingly large-scale matter can exist in a state of superposition where multiple realities overlap as long as the right observation conditions are in place. Taking this even further into the realm of consciousness is the experiment known as Wigner's friend. Here's the setup. A friend is inside a room observing the Schrodinger's cat experiment, while Wigner is outside, observing the friend and everything in the room. When the friend opens the box and checks the result, reality is determined for the friend. But from Wigner's perspective outside, until the friend tells him the result, the friend, the cat, and the entire room are still in a state of superposition. That's the paradox. This isn't just a philosophical trick. Recently, Heriot-Watt University in the UK recreated this situation using photons in an actual experiment. The result? The reality as seen by the friend and reality as seen by Wigner genuinely came apart exactly as quantum theory predicts. This experiment also confirmed a violation of Bell inequalities. A violation of Bell inequalities is a mathematical signature that quantum effects were occurring in that system. In other words, there may be no such thing as a single, absolute, objective truth in this universe. Different realities may be simultaneously valid for different observers. Doesn't that just blow your mind? Even when someone tells you that's impossible, from your perspective as an observer, a completely different, ideal world line might exist right there in superposition. So why is it that our consciousness can select one reality from these multiple possibilities? To explore that secret, let's expand our view even further and examine the relationship between the structure of the universe itself and information. From here, let's zoom out even further and talk about what kind of structure this universe actually has. In cutting-edge physics, there's a way of looking at this world called block universe theory. In simple terms, it's the idea that every moment of past, present, and future already exists simultaneously, like individual pages in a flipbook, all contained within one massive block. The sense that time is flowing is just our consciousness sequentially scanning through that block, nothing more. But here, a natural question arises. If that's the case, where is the original data for all these images? One answer that physicists around the world are focusing on right now is the holographic universe theory. This is the astonishing theory that the three-dimensional world we live in might actually be nothing more than a projection from a two-dimensional information surface at the edge of the universe. Just like a holographic sticker on a credit card looks three-dimensional despite being flat, all matter in this world can ultimately be traced back to a projection of information. Digging even deeper into this information mechanism is a field of study called loop quantum gravity. According to this theory, space itself is made up of extremely tiny information networks called spin networks. Space isn't an empty void, it's composed of an incredibly fine mesh that's invisible to the eye, and the way that mesh connects determines the physical laws of this world. And now we arrive at a term that touches the very core of today's discussion, boundary conditions. Boundary conditions refers to the framework where the information network is divided and bounded. In physics, there's a rule that the surface area of this boundary determines how much information can be contained within it. The larger the surface area, the more information can be written into it, and as a result, the informational mass of that object increases. In other words, even in what appears to be empty space, if the boundary conditions change, the density of information that can be absorbed changes, and the weight of the matter that appears there changes as well. This connects directly to the true nature of what I call the life information core. The boundary conditions of what kind of being you are in this world determine the amount of information you can absorb. And the higher that information density, the greater the heavy mass your existence carries in information space. Next, let's explore how this weight of information triggers physical attraction using Einstein's famous equation to break down the mechanism. Now, let's finally get to the heart of this video, uncovering the true identity of the law of attraction from the perspective of physics. In my model, the law of attraction is an extremely physical phenomenon. It's the gravitational potential gradient that you create in information space. To understand this, let's take a peek into the world of general relativity proposed by Einstein. Einstein said that gravity is really the curvature of space. For example, imagine placing a heavy iron ball on a stretched fabric. The weight causes the fabric to sink. It's precisely because of that dip, that well, that a small marble nearby naturally rolls toward the iron ball along the slope. As it turns out, the exact same thing is happening in the invisible world of information. What I call the life information core is essentially an iron ball placed in information space. The kind of core of consciousness you hold and how high your abstraction level is when you observe the world. The heavier that information mass, the deeper the well that forms in the field of information space. This well is the gravitational potential in information space. In other words, the energy gradient. When a strong gradient forms in information space, what happens? All the information data within the range of that gradient, your ideal future, the connections you need, opportunities, they all come flooding toward you on their own, like a ball rolling down a slope. This, in my model, is the physical mechanism behind what we call the law of attraction. In other words, attraction isn't about desperately trying to pull something toward you. It's a state where the world naturally gets sucked into the well created by your core. Next, let me go deeper into the essence of how the life information core, the source of this gravity, actually generates the energy that moves reality. What do you think the true nature of energy is in physics? Energy is essentially the potential difference in any given space. In other words, a gradient. The easiest example to understand is potential energy. A ball at a high place rolls downward because there's a gradient, a difference in height in gravitational potential. Likewise, voltage, the force that makes electricity flow, is actually created by a gradient called electrical potential difference. Heat transfers because of temperature differences. Magnets attract objects because of potential differences in the magnetic field. In other words, no energy in this world can ever be generated unless there is a potential difference, a gradient in the space. And this applies to the law of attraction in exactly the same way. When your life information core creates a deep well in information space, an informational potential difference, in other words, an information gradient, is born there. This gradient itself becomes the tremendous energy that moves reality. Think of the sun in our solar system. The sun has such overwhelming mass that it warps the surrounding space-time enormously, creating an incredibly deep gravity gradient. Because of that intense energy gradient, Earth, Mars, and every other planet has no choice but to get caught up in the sun's gravitational pull and orbit around it. In the same way, if your core can overlap and create a steep gradient in information space, an overwhelming attraction energy is generated there. That energy drags all the information data you need, connections, health, and money into your reality on its own, like a ball rolling down a slope. You don't have to chase anything desperately. If the core at your center is heavy enough, the world has no choice but to revolve around you. On the other hand, what happens to someone with a small life information core? They can't create a potential difference, a gradient in information space, so energy simply doesn't get generated. As a result, their power to pull things in is weak, and opportunities just pass them by. Worse yet, they get sucked into someone else's stronger gravity or the powerful gradient of society's dominant rules and end up being tossed around instead. That's why you can't just wish for things. You need to rewrite the life information core inside you and create an overwhelming potential difference in information space that's the starting line for all attraction. Now, from here, let me explain the specific mechanism of how to increase that weight of information and convert it into the energy that moves reality. First, let me clarify the definition of information energy, which I also teach in my program. Information energy, in terms of information dynamics, refers to the breadth of information held by an individual, specifically the abstraction level of that information. This might be easier to understand with a corporate analogy. A regular employee typically only knows about their own specific tasks, but a CEO holds information about the entire company. They might not see the minute details on the ground, but in return, they sit at the very top of the company's entire information umbrella. The wider and bigger the information umbrella you sit atop, the higher your abstraction level and the higher your information energy as an individual. To generalize this further, someone who thinks only about themselves has significantly lower information energy than someone who also thinks about others. For instance, Starting from a state where you're only wishing for success and money for myself in information space, this actually has very low energy. But the moment a goal that involves others, like I want my family, friends, and clients to be happy too, gets layered on top, the information density increases and things suddenly get much heavier. However, this level of abstraction is something many people already have. If it only extends to people who share your immediate interests, the sphere of influence caps out at a few hundred people. To extract the kind of information energy that can radically change your reality, you need to raise your perspective even higher. For example, having a spatial expansion that encompasses your community, your country, or the entire planet. And beyond that, having a temporal axis, wanting to leave something better for humanity 500 years, 1,000 years into the future, long after you're gone. When you genuinely envision and act on a goal that encompasses the happiness of all humankind, other living beings, and even the entire global environment across generations, your life information core acquires an enormous mass in information space. That enormous weight generates the intense potential difference I described earlier, an overwhelming energy gradient. Just as the sun attracts planets to its mass, when your core grows heavy enough to encompass many beings, a powerful information gravity is generated. Connections, financial success, health, everything gets dragged into that distortion on its own. The way I interpret this, it's the real logic behind the law of attraction. Conversely, at a low abstraction level, where you're only thinking about yourself and just want to be happy, you can't create a deep gradient in information space. No gradient means no energy is generated, which means you end up being tossed around by the waves of life, stuck in a pattern where attraction just doesn't work. From here, let's get into the practical side, how you can actually start changing your life. First, let me talk about the method trap that so many people fall into. There are lots of wonderful practices out there, affirmations, journaling techniques, meditation, but honestly, most people who are doing these things diligently see absolutely zero change in their reality. Why do you think that is? It's because your life information core is still small and you're just trying to use surface level techniques. As I just explained, the law of attraction is a movement of energy driven by the gradient in information space. When your core is hollow and there's no well forming in information space whatsoever, no matter how many words you repeat or images you visualize, there's simply no energy being generated to move reality. It's like pressing the switch on an empty dam, no electricity is going to flow. That's why the very first thing you should do is not to practice methods, but to rewrite your life information core itself, to make it heavier and bigger. In other words, to explosively increase the information mass of your very being. So, how can you increase that mass? The key lies in the abstraction level of your goals. Successful people, the ones others describe as having an aura, without exception, have an incredibly heavy life information core. They unconsciously observe the world from a high perspective that transcends their individual ego. That's why a powerful energy gradient forms in information space, and all kinds of fortune flow in on their own. Even if you're at absolute rock bottom right now, it's okay. Once you perform this core rewriting, from today, from this very moment, the way the world moves around, you will physically begin to change. Now let me walk you through the specific steps for raising your abstraction level and making your core heavier. Most people's desires stay confined to their own individual scope. I want to earn more. I want more recognition. I want an amazing partner. In information dynamics, this is what we call a low abstraction level. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But because the range of that information is confined to a single person yourself, its informational density is low and it doesn't carry enough weight to warp the space around it. On the other hand, people who dramatically transform their lives race up the abstraction ladder all at once from this point. First, you set a goal that involves the people around you, family, friends, clients, colleagues. I want everyone to be happy together. Just this alone expands your information umbrella and makes your core a little heavier. But to create the kind of gravity that truly hacks reality, you need to go even further. For example, developing a spatial expansion. I want to energize all of Japan. Or I want to solve global environmental problems. Even better, holding a goal that transcends time. I want to leave behind a world where humanity can thrive 500 or 1,000 years from now, long after I'm gone. You might think, there's no way I could do something that big. But here's the interesting part. Whether you can actually achieve that goal right now doesn't matter at all. What matters is that you begin genuinely observing the world from that high perspective. The moment you do, your life information core instantly evolves into a massive, heavy entity encompassing information at the scale of hundreds of millions of people and spanning centuries. Just as the sun attracts planets through its mass, once your core becomes that heavy, an irresistible information gravity is generated. And within that massive distortion, as a natural side effect, your personal desires, things like earning 10 million a year or finding the ideal partner, get swept up and realized on their own. And now we come to the most important point of all. Once you've set a goal at a high abstraction level, you then need to ground that weight from information space into this physical space. The truth is, just holding a lofty goal in your head won't complete the rendering the manifestation into physical reality. It's only when you carve the massive gradient you've created in information space into this world through actual physical action that energy begins to flow and reality starts to move. For example, putting out content to make society better, or taking a concrete first step to help someone. When this high abstraction purpose and concrete action lock together, a powerful consciousness field rises up and the rewriting of reality accelerates explosively. In fact, among my students, there are countless examples of doors that were completely shut, suddenly opening one after another, and unexpected resources and connections flooding in the moment they started working to expand the possibilities of others beyond their own self-interest. Don't let your ideals remain just fantasies. Embody your future self right now and take action. This is the process of channeling high informational potential energy into reality through a physical switch. It's the sign that you've begun directly intervening in the source code of the game of life, exercising your authority as its administrator. But doesn't a big question come up here? Why can one person's consciousness and actions have such an incredibly powerful effect on the world around them? It's just confirmation bias or coincidence happening in the individual's brain that's been the conventional thinking. But that may be far from the whole story. Some of the boldest work in cutting-edge physics now points toward the law of attraction being not just something that happens in our individual brains, but a mechanism built into the very fabric of the universe itself. At the end of 2025, a paper published in a world-renowned academic journal by Uppsala University in Sweden offered one provocative answer, and the story of what happened to that paper afterward is just as revealing. When you decode this paper, you'll see exactly how information gravity and the life information core, everything I've been talking about today, snap into this picture. The final piece clicks into place. Now, let me share what could be called the climax of this video, the boldest blueprint of the universe that cutting-edge science has put on the table. At the end of 2025, a paper published in the peer-reviewed journal AIP Advances by Professor Maria Strama and her team at Uppsala University sent shockwaves through the world of physics. Their conclusion completely overturns everything we thought we knew. In simple terms, they built a mathematical framework in which this universe has no physical substance, its true nature is a universal consciousness field. Now, I have to be straight with you about what happened next. In 2026, the journal retracted this paper, and the reason matters. It wasn't fraud, and it wasn't a calculation error. The official reason was that the theory's central concept had no measurable quantity attached to it. Its predictions could not be tested or falsified with today's experimental tools. Think about what that actually means. The paper wasn't proven wrong. Modern physics simply has no instrument that can measure a consciousness field, so the idea was ruled out of bounds. Mainstream physics is built on the premise that physical space is all there is, and ideas like this sit outside its frame. But the history of science is full of concepts that were untestable right up until someone invented the way to test them. From the future's point of view, I believe fields like this will eventually be brought onto the examination table. Until now, consciousness has been thought of as a mere byproduct, a kind of bonus generated by the physical brain. But this framework flips that completely on its head. In their framework, consciousness itself is the most fundamental field that constitutes the universe, on par with, or even more fundamental than, gravity and electromagnetism. In other words, if they're right, this world that we think of as matter is nothing more than a temporary phenomenon appearing within the vast ocean of consciousness. If you don't realize this, you'll spend your entire life being tossed around by the images in front of you, living a life that never goes the way you want. But once you understand the hierarchical nature of the world revealed by this paper, you can design your desired reality with your own will, like choosing a movie on Netflix. Now, let's take a closer look at the hierarchical structure of the world that this paper has uncovered. Professor Strom and her team explained that this universe is built on three fundamental principles. Those are the three-layer structure of mind, consciousness, and thought. At the very foundation lies universal mind. Think of it as a source of pure energy that has not yet taken any form. That is intelligence itself, the force that powers all life, and you can picture it as a still ocean brimming with infinite potential. Next, emerging from that is universal consciousness. This is like a screen onto which everything is projected. The true identity of what physics calls information space, or the quantum information field, is actually this vast consciousness field. Stored here in an infinite supply are every conceivable pattern of reality candidates, still in an undetermined wave state. What Buddhism calls alaya vijnana, storehouse, consciousness, and what the spiritual world calls the Akashic records are, in the language of modern physics, this very universal consciousness field. And finally, the switch that cuts out a specific reality from these infinite possibilities is universal thought. This corresponds to what quantum mechanics calls observation. The process of thought acts as a trigger, selecting a specific pattern from the wave of possibilities and rendering it into a tangible reality that we can experience with our five senses. In other words, thought plays the role of the collapse operator, the force that turns waves into particles. Remarkably, this paper suggests that the act of thinking that we perform every day isn't merely a chemical reaction in the brain. It's the equivalent of entering a command that runs the source code of the universe itself. So, how can we apply this grand structure of the universe to our own lives? Next, I'll reveal how my theory of the life information core connects to this hierarchical structure. These three layers, mind, consciousness, and thought, are actually the exact same process through which my life information core theory rewrites reality. The concept of the life information core, which is the heart of my program, is essentially a blueprint for your life that is written into this vast universal consciousness field. When you expand your life information core and raise your abstraction level, what you're really doing is elevating your perspective from individual, small-scale thought up to the level of universal consciousness and universal mind itself. Do you understand why this is so critically important? When you raise your abstraction level and connect to a higher dimension of consciousness, you are directly touching the wave state where every possibility is superposed and nothing has yet solidified into a particle. In other words, the field of possibilities. Remember the double-slit experiment from part 2. Before observation, quantum particles existed in a wave state where they could go anywhere. In fact, this wave state is the realm with the highest energy and the easiest to rewrite. When you move the data in the field of possibilities at this high dimension, the physical reality projected from it, the world that has already solidified into particles, begins to shift fluidly in response. Conversely, the reason most people fail at the law of attraction is that they're desperately trying to change reality at the low abstraction level of individual ego. The physical reality right in front of your eyes, already frozen solid as particles, trying to brute force change the results that have already been determined is nearly impossible. It's like trying to change a movie by grabbing the screen. No matter how hard you try, the image won't change and you'll just exhaust yourself. Instead, you need to access the projector, the universal consciousness, at a high abstraction level, the very source of information, and rewrite the source code itself. Rather than thinking only of your own benefit, by holding a high goal that embraces more and more people, your life information core synchronizes with this vast consciousness field and generates information gravity that transcends physical limits. At that point, you are no longer an NPC in the game of life, being tossed around. You are the administrator who intervenes in the creative process of the universe itself, and you begin rendering your ideal reality. Science is finally catching up to this picture of the world. The reality you're experiencing is not some unchangeable rock. It's a canvas that can be repainted endlessly, depending on your abstraction level. Now, from here, let me explain what raising your abstraction level, which I've been talking about throughout this video, physically means. To uncover that truth, Let me first share my perspective on dimensions. In my lectures, I define a dimension as the number of degrees of freedom in which you can move. 0D is a point. If you shift it in one direction and stack them, you get a 1D line. Shift lines and you get a 2D plane. Shift planes and you get a 3D solid. Mathematically speaking, this is essentially a calculus relationship. By infinitesimally shifting one lower dimension and stacking it, you produce the next higher dimension. So what is the fourth dimension, the dimension you get by shifting our 3D world? Since you can't shift any further in space, you shift along the axis of time. In other words, it's the result of shifting and stacking the positional information of objects in 3D space over time. This is 4D space-time. Furthermore, in cutting-edge theories like string theory, it's said that the universe may have 5, 10, or even 11 dimensions. Following this logic, the fifth dimension is what you get by shifting the fourth dimension. Since you can no longer shift in space or time, you consider different histories occurring at the same time and place. In other words, the fifth dimension is the world of parallel histories, where history itself becomes the parameter. And beyond that, the sixth dimension. This is what you get by further shifting the fifth dimension. In other words, the variation of whose perspective is this world being seen from. It's the personality of the observer, the dimension of observer variations. In fact, this idea of variations in consciousness aligns astonishingly well with what some cutting-edge physics now proposes as the true nature of the universe. Now, let's climb even further up the dimensional staircase and talk about the ultimate layers of this universe. Earlier, I said the sixth dimension is the variation of the observer's personality. Beyond that lies the seventh dimension. This is the domain where you integrate, mathematically speaking, integrate all the infinite variations of consciousness into one. It's collective consciousness itself, a transcendent, unified dimension that goes beyond any individual perspective and what has been called the realm of God since ancient times. Going further to the eighth and ninth dimensions, you arrive at even more fundamental energy domains, like a hierarchy within the realm of the gods, integrating everything even further. Remarkably, my way of understanding dimensions aligns quite closely with the three-layer structure of the universe proposed in that retracted Uppsala paper, the one mainstream physics doesn't yet have the tools to test. Professor Strom and her team identify three elements that constitute the universe: mind, consciousness, and thought. First, the highest layer, universal mind. This is the source of intelligence that powers all life, the source itself, similar to what I described as 8D, 9D, the source realm. Next, emerging from that universal consciousness. This is the 7D level collective consciousness field, serving as the screen that encompasses all of 5D information space. Here, every conceivable pattern of parallel worlds is stored in an infinite supply, still in an undetermined wave state. And finally, universal thought. This becomes a switch that selects a specific reality from these infinite possibilities. In other words, the act of what we think from which perspective is itself the confirmation process, rendering or projecting a specific universe from the sixth dimension down through the fifth and into the physical reality of 4D. Once you understand this structure, you can see a strikingly consistent logic connecting our level of consciousness directly to physical reality. So, within this grand multi-layered structure of the universe, how should we wield our life information core? Next, I'll apply this higher dimensional theory to the reality of our lives and explain why raising your abstraction level is the ultimate form of attraction. This dimensional staircase from 0D to 9D, this is the true identity of what I call abstraction level, and it's the shortest route to rewriting your reality. Most people who are struggling to change their reality are actually fighting at a very low dimension, the fourth or fifth. The fourth dimension, physical reality bound by time and space, is a world that has already solidified into particles. Trying to forcefully move a particle that has already been determined is like trying to push a massive boulder with your bare hands. On the other hand, what happens when you raise your abstraction level and elevate your consciousness to the sixth dimension, the seventh, and then to the eighth and ninth, which could be called the source realm? The higher the dimension, the more degrees of freedom increase. At the seventh dimension and above the realms of collective consciousness and universal mind, reality still exists as a formless wave, a field of possibilities where infinite potentials are superposed. Remember the double-slit experiment from part 2. Before observation, the quantum existed in a wave state where it could go anywhere. Moving a wave at a high dimension is overwhelmingly more energy efficient than moving a solidified particle. When you set a high abstraction level goal that looks beyond your individual benefit to your community, to the earth, to a future hundreds of years from now, at that moment, your life information core transcends the sixth-dimensional individual personality and begins connecting directly with the energy of universal mind at the seventh and eighth dimensions. This is like directly accessing the layer where the source code of the universe is written and rewriting the very images that are about to be rendered. By moving the wave of possibilities just slightly at a higher dimension, by the time it's projected into the fourth dimensional physical world, it manifests as dramatic changes in the form of connections, money, and opportunities. If the Uppsala team's model, Retracted or not, turns out to be right, the foundation of this universe is a consciousness field. Will you remain confined in the individual consciousness of a low dimension, being tossed around by an already determined reality? Or will you stand in the collective consciousness of a high dimension and live as an administrator who freely designs the possibilities of the future? Now that you have this dimensional perspective, you already know which path to choose. Science is finally catching up to this picture of the world. The reality you're experiencing is not some unchangeable rock, it's a canvas that can be repainted endlessly depending on your abstraction level. Even if you currently feel like my reality is still trapped inside a solidified particle, that simply means you didn't know the method of observing from one dimension higher. Once you climb the dimensional staircase I've shared today and stand at the perspective of collective consciousness, the seventh and eighth dimensions, your past, your future, and even your current financial situation and relationships all transform into data whose source code can be rewritten. However, how to actually wield this administrator's perspective in your daily life and concretely rewrite your life information core. That process involves more specific and highly confidential steps that simply can't be fully covered in an open space like YouTube. That's why I'm creating a free, in-depth resource that walks you through exercising your authority as an administrator and rendering your ideal reality step by step from this very moment. It's coming soon, exclusively for subscribers of this channel, so subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell and you'll be first in line the moment it goes live. And while you wait, drop a comment below. Tell me your experience with the law of attraction or the one question you want me to answer next. If you're truly serious about becoming someone who designs the world with your own will, that comment is your first act of observation. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.